What's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about the Sony A7C, which is what I'm recording on right now. It is not this camera that I'm holding. I'm holding a different camera, so I have something to do with my hands, so I'm not constantly using them to talk. I recognize now that this is confusing, since we're reviewing a different camera today. This is a mistake. I'm sorry. Alright, this is better. At least we're holding the box that the camera came in. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking about the Sony A7C, which I'm recording on right now, and we're going to review that in this video today. I've had this camera for the last month, gotten to test it out, and I am in love with this camera so far, so we're going to talk about that today. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll know if maybe you want to get this camera. Before we do that, though, we got to launch the jet ski first. I'll take you along and record everything on the Sony A7C, so you'll get to see a little bit of the image quality test. So let's go launch the jet ski, and then we'll talk about this camera. Before we get this thing on the truck, we got to put the battery in, and hopefully it's charged enough to start. I charged it for like an hour, so. All right, ready to go. Now after all that work, let's see if she starts. Woo! There we go. Right now we're testing out the new Sony A7C. The Sony A7C is my new camera. It's a entry-level full-frame Sony camera. It comes in about $1,800. It's kind of like the updated, smaller version of the Sony A7 III with a few less photo capabilities, but a little bit better on the video side. Now this camera is definitely not for everyone, but I hope that this review will be able to help you decide whether or not you think that this camera is right for you. Alright, so first off, let's talk specs. The Sony A7C is a 24 megapixel full frame camera. It's got the Bion ZX image processor. Now it shoots 4K up to 30 frames per second and 120 frames per second in HD. Now I made my dad wash his car so I could test out the 120 frames per second on him to get that nice creamy smooth slow motion. So here's some of those shots right now, and as you see, it's totally usable. It starts to fall apart a little bit when you're using S-Log, and then you start to get some noise in the shadows. Now, one of the improvements over the Sony A7 III is the A7C now has Sony's new eye autofocus in video function. So now it can track onto your eye while you're recording video. So right now I see a little box around my eye on the LCD screen, so I know that I'm in focus, which actually brings me to the LCD screen. The Sony A7C now has an articulating touch LCD screen. The touch function is very limited. It's only for picking an autofocus point. There's not full touch functions in the menu system, which is unfortunate, but at least you have the touch to focus function. Now it has 5-axis in-body image stabilization, but that's not the big thing to me. The big thing is the gyro data. The Sony A7C now records the gyro data, so you can put that in a program called Catalyst Browse, and it'll smooth out that footage so nicely. Now, one of my favorite things about this camera has to be the dynamic range. When shooting an S-Log 2, it claims 15 stops of dynamic range, and as you can see from this shot right here, I think that's pretty accurate. Right now I'm shooting an S-Log 2. You have to kind of overexpose the image when you're shooting it in camera. So this is what the raw image looks like, but as you can see that sunset behind me, and you can see my face, and nothing is underexposed or blown out. So the dynamic range when shooting an S-Log 2 is pretty amazing. This just goes to show you that you can get some great quality out of the camera. Another thing I love is the autofocus. You know, it has that eye autofocus system. It's great. It never loses you. It's good in photo and video. You have to play with some of the settings with the sensitivity and transition speeds, but once you get that dialed in, the video is perfect. Another pro is the flip screen. I love that. I came from the Canon M50, so a flip screen was kind of a must for me after I gotten used to that. We're also moving in a blue hour right now. The sun just set, so if the lighting changes dramatically, we'll just adjust this ND filter. I also love the continuous shooting and the super fast like burst modes that it has for capturing high action shots. Now another great thing about this camera is the low light performance. Really cuts down on noise. Sometimes if you're using S-Log in low light, you have to do some noise removal. The last big pro that I want to talk about is the battery life. The battery life is so great. The Canon M50, I'd go through a battery every like 30 minutes. On this camera, even shooting in 4K, sometimes I can make it a whole day on one battery. And if I'm just shooting photos, I can make it like 3 or 4 days on one battery before I have to charge it. All right, now some of the cons of this camera, luckily a lot of the cons are software related, so hopefully they can be fixed in further firmware updates if enough of us complain about them. There's definitely some weird software glitches that they need to work out. For example, you lose eye autofocus when you have phone control enabled on the camera, not even when you're connected to the phone, but just if that box is checked in the camera settings, then you lose eye autofocus in video. I couldn't figure out why I wasn't getting eye autofocus, but as soon as you turn off the control with smartphone function, you get eye autofocus back. The EVF is not great, but we knew that going into this camera. I never use EVF with mirrorless cameras anyway, because it's just showing you the same picture that you're seeing on the LCD screen. It's not like a DSLR where you're actually looking at the kind of mirrored image. On a mirrorless camera, it's just showing like a smaller LCD screen anyway, so it's not great. I never use it. I just have the feature completely shut off because my finger always goes over it and then it shuts off the LCD screen when I don't want it to. So I just leave that shut off all the time, and I never use the EVF. Tons of people have said this, but this camera just needs one more dial right where your index finger goes on the camera. That'd be great just to have one more dial, because I don't like how the shutter and the ISO is on the same dial. And for the ISO, you have to press the button once to the right and then you can adjust it. So if it just had one more dial, I'm not talking about all these extra custom buttons, because I know that that's not what this camera's for, but just another little dial on the front would have been great. The last con I have with this camera is the size. Some of you think that that's great, that it's a compact full frame camera, but I didn't buy this camera for the size. I bought it for the flip screen and the 4K and all the fancy Sony features, but I don't like having a smaller camera body, so I have it rigged up with a small rig cage, and I didn't think that I'd keep that on there, but since I put it on to the camera, I've never taken the small rig cage off. For photo, for video, I just like having that little extra grip by the pinky finger, and it's just nice to hold on to so you know you're not gonna drop the camera. Now, who is this camera for? That's a fair question, because no one expected this camera, no one really asked for it, no one even wanted it. But that's because I think this camera has a very specific target. Now, if you look at this camera thinking it's gonna replace your Sony A7 III, sadly, you're gonna be disappointed. It's different. It's not an upgrade, it's more of a side grade. So if you're primarily a video shooter, but you also like doing photos, so maybe like 60% video, 40% photos, then yeah, this camera's for you. But if you're 60% photos and 40% video work, then go with the A7 III. With the one exception being if you're an event videographer. I still think the A7 III is a better option because you have redundant recording with 2 card slots. That's not to say you can't do weddings or events with the Sony A7C, but I wouldn't do super expensive ones, because if you lose that footage, you're gonna have a very angry bride on your hands. Now for me, I do about 50% video work, 50% photo work. However, I do get paid for video work. I haven't gotten paid for my photography yet. So I figured, you know, if I'm doing video client work, I should pick a camera that's primarily focused on video to really upgrade my craft there. So that's why I lean towards the A7C over the A7 III. And the A7S III is a great camera. It was a little out of my budget because I want to pick up some nice lenses for this camera. In the future, we'll see about that A7 III. Or the A7 IV will come out, and we could go with that. So that's everything I have to say about the Sony A7 III. Overall, it's a great camera. If you think you want to pick it up, go for it. You're not going to be disappointed with it. It's great as a second shooter if you already have an A7S III or an A7 III, but it's also great as a primary camera. That's all for me today. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.